Today, my name is Jessica Milgroom, and this is Loa Niumeitolu. I'm not going to manage. Do you want to say your last name?
You got it, Jessica.
Niumeitolu. And I guess just to start, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Ko ke hutanga he whakatapu. Ke whakahauka mai whakongia koe ni. Whakawhetai, whakamāngongo, ke whangakui, ke tupuanga e whanui ka ekspoti I mani. Ke loa tupuanga, o kui kai ke mahino lele ko hai mo tōu. Tau ofa o tui mo ngāu e ngāu. Ke whoki mai ai manatu I. Mo I lo, me tupuanga e whanui. Jessica and I would like to honor the Indigenous people of this land of Berkeley. My elders and ancestors of Moana Nui, I'm Tongan, and I just spoke in my native language, Tongan. Teach me to honor the Indigenous people of the lands I live in. This is an Indigenous protocol. Should we honor the Indigenous ancestors of Berkeley, England, that I do not know their names? And I have asked the speakers and chairs of this conference, and they told me that it's difficult for them to understand too. So it's with faith and good work that their names and their stewardship be known and honored one day, that we honor them today. We also like to honor the Indigenous people, the Indigenous culture, the Indigenous ecosystems and foodways that the British Empire created genocide, exterminated, and colonized, and have created settler colonial systems that continue to commit atrocities of genocide in these lands and endless wars that continue today. I also want to honor all of your relatives, your ancestors, relatives, those of you who are here in this room. And I want to honor Jessica's ancestors very much as we sit together here for this conversation. And of course, they will be very present with us in this conversation in the stories that she tells. And of course, I would like to honor my ancestors in Moana Nui for their love and their care in bringing me to this room to be with all of you. And with that, we also want to thank the great organizers of our FC, particularly Carla and Francesca and Brittany and the rest of the gang who helped us a lot to be part of this session this morning or afternoon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Loa. So I wanted to share a little bit about how this session came about before we introduce ourselves and dive into the session. I approached the organizers of RFC about doing a presentation, and they got back to me and said, well, what about having a conversation with Loa? We didn't know each other, and so they sent our bios to each other. We read our respective bios, and I made a proposal to her, and I said, well, what about if I interview you? No, what if I ask you some questions about your work and your life and your experience? And she came back to me and she said, well, what about if we have a conversation? Because my perspective was, as a non-native person, I want to value and prioritize her stories. And she came back to me with the counter proposal saying, well, actually, let's break down these hierarchies. All of these knowledges and experiences are equally as important. And so we kind of, as through our conversation, really grew to understand that this relationship between the colonizer and the colonized that we both represent in one way or another is highly complex, full of grays and difficulties in understanding in this particular political moment that we are in, how do we relate, how do we walk forward together, how do we value and honor each other's knowledge and experience. So the main message or question that we came to want to discuss and converse about today is, how can we walk forward together in healing the wound of colonization through food? So with that, I would ask you, Loa, should I present myself first? Yeah, good. So my name is Jessica Milgroom. I grew up in the US. My ancestry is from more than 15 countries in Northern and Eastern Europe. Much of my family has been in the US since early colonial times. I've been passionate about food and the politics of food since I was an adolescent, and I've been working a lot on dispossession of people from their lands. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a particular project that I'm working on now. I'm not going to talk so much about the project itself and the content of the project, but more the experience of the work that I've been doing. My grandfather was instrumental in commercializing and appropriating a native food in the United States. He grew up close or on a native reservation in northern Minnesota, in the sort of north part of the US. And he wrote a manuscript about this process, about how this food went from being a sacred, traditional native food to a commercialized, domesticated food that's now exported all around the world. And he never finished this manuscript before he passed away. And this manuscript fell in my hands, and since then, for about the last 5 years, I've been sorting out, what to do with this manuscript, how to finish it, what our family story is, and what can be learned for this particular moment in history about appropriation of foods. And one thing that I've been really working with is how can I tell the story? What story can I tell? And the way in which appropriation is not something of the past. Appropriation is something that's continued regularly all the time. It's reproduced, and what's going on there. So this has been a really fascinating journey, and this is part of the journey that I'm going to be talking about today. Loa?
Okay, Jessica, thank you so much. So my name is Loa, as you can see. I'm Tongan. I'm from the island nation of Tongan, Pasifika. We know that region of the world as Loa Niumeitolu. It includes what the Europeans have called Colonised, Melanesia, and Micronesia. In Melanesia, we also say, for Loa Niumeitolu, we face one salt water, one salt water prison, and also in the Chamorro of Guam, we say Tau Tau Tatsu, one sea. So I migrated to the US. So the story that I'm about to tell, I hope it's not briefly, it's of course like a huge story, but it's about how I left to the land, my indigenous home, because I was born in the 1970s, and that we were forced to leave home, to go into the developed country. That's the idea, because our islands were too small in resources and also too small in mind to be able to sustain our people into the 20th century. That's the idea. That's the idea, the settler colonial idea. So being born in the 1970s, we were forced to move. We had to move to a developed country. And so I migrated to the US in the 1980s through the Mormon church, who was in Tonga, and baptized my mother. I got politicized through college, actually my sister's college, during the first Persian Gulf War in 1990. I'm just going to give you details so you could see some things about my journey and how we're going to talk about and this concept of colonization, settler colonialism, and how we are trying to reclaim it, and especially in our conversation today with food. I went on a more than classified mission when I was 21 years old. Also, I returned home to Tonga for the first time in 1995, that's where I got reacquainted with the land of my birth and my ancestor. I returned to the United States because of wanting to come back and go to college, and I continued on to grad school. And after that, my young son and I came to the Bay Area, to the San Francisco Bay Area, which I heard is Ohlone Territory, where I live today in Berkeley, California. Huichin, Lisjan Ohlone Territory. I came here in 2009 to join my sister. At that time, too, I joined a Pasifika queer women's art and activist group to bring awareness to our Pasifika community here in the Bay Area. At that time, there was a call too. I feel this was like a resurgence of many things. To me, this was the beginning of my life here in the United States, the beginning of seeing a lot of different communities, including the Ohlone here in the San Francisco Bay Area, having a resurgence of their reclaiming their language, rematriating their land. And in 2009, there was a call by the Native people that was led by the Ohlone for people here in the Bay Area, from all people, to please join their fight to preserve a sacred site called Sigorate in the Lego. And that is something that I organized with my Pasifika community to join. And that was something that was that changed my life. As an Indigenous person who had been separated from my Indigenous land, Loa Niumeitolu, to be together with the Ohlone and to be together with Indigenous people of the Americas, what's called the Imperial Island. That changed my life completely. It gave me a new awareness and belonging that I never had before. Because settler belonging, as told by the late Cleve Benelli, a land protector, it's a practice that never worked for me, settler belonging, because I'm an Indigenous person. And I'll finish up here, Jessica. At the same time, there was a voyage. There was a Pasifika voyage on traditional voyaging communities that came to the Bay Area. There were 6 canoes that came. It was funded by a German band, but the crew, they were Pasifika people, Indigenous people, and the canoes themselves were the traditional Pasifika canoes. And in that, I met the navigator, from the Cook Islands, who was the navigator of the Manamaru Atua canoe, and we fell in love, and I went back to Atu. It's his homeland, in the Cook Islands, and that's where I learned about, well, I relearned, because it's something that I knew when I was a kid before I left home. I relearned about how to grow our taro, our bananas, our gava, the flowers that are so essential for us in using our garlands every day as a cultural practice. And from there, I returned here to Ohlone Territory, and I worked with Sigorate. Sigorate became a land trust, and I worked with them to extend my understanding of what is Indigenous and live with Indigenous people and live in an Indigenous way, in this way that we live here today in the San Francisco Bay Area. That, though, is a very modern place, you know? And I'll finish up with saying, and that's also how I came to steward a piece of land and work at Tennyson High School Farm, work as a steward, land steward, and also a high school teacher to teach about land stewardship and how to honor the land and connect that to high school students and their families. And then I also facilitate a piece of land in a group of Pasifika people at Kailoli House, which is an estate in here, close by, but it's in Ramaytush territory, here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Loa. Yes?
Sorry, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm finding it really hard to understand the sound, and I was wondering if there's anything that can be done. If it's just me, I can...
Yeah.
Really, really hard.
It's hard to understand.
Mic, maybe. Do you have your microphone on while she's speaking?
No. It's on the other end. It's on the Zoom end. It's not working, I'm afraid.
Does she maybe have headphones?
Do you have headphones that you could try or another microphone that you could connect?
Oh, I'm so sorry, you guys. Oh, the sound is not good in my garden. I do have my headphones, but they're not charged.
They're not? Charged. Oh, charged. Bummer. Is it sufficient enough to be able to continue? Yeah? Sorry about that sound issue. So we have a couple of questions that we're going to each answer. Loa, for sake of time, I propose that we put together question 1 and 2. Yeah, because we're short on time here. So one of these, the main question is, how do we work with food? How do we work with food to heal this wound of colonization? So this question has been something that asking it from the perspective of a white person, settler, colonial, descendant family. What can I do? What can I do in my day-to-day life? What is the importance of food? What's the centrality of food? And Loa will answer this question from the perspective of an Indigenous person. So in this work that I've been doing on wild rice, a number of things have really come up. It's been much more, it's been a very deep personal process of unlearning. So I would say the first thing is about unlearning and unerasing, in the sense of the food system has been, one of the colonial tactics has been to erase the Indigenous food system, as also, as we heard in the panel before us, has also been to erase connection, to destroy connection between others, our understanding of our codependency, and also our connection with earth, connection with food, connection with plants. So I always think that change happens, and these kind of healing processes happen at a very personal level and all the way up through community and at a global level. And it's something that I think is really important to be working at all of those levels at the same time. So it's a process of unlearning and relearning, and also a process of action at a personal level and allyship. This is my experience, not anyone else's, of course. Not that I'm saying this is what you should do, this is my experience. So when food is relationship to place, food is the nexus of relationship to place. It's what connects us to understanding what grows in what location, the knowledge of place, the knowledge of the way that we nourish ourselves. It's about our relationship to our plant and animal relatives. It's about our relationship to our own spirituality. So in this act of severing relationship, for me, one of the most powerful acts of reconstruction is rebuilding those relationships. And this process of unlearning and relearning, I think, one of the things that's been a huge change over the last few years has been the recognition of lands. Where are we from? Whose land are we on? 5 years ago, starting meetings, you would never hear that. And now you hear it almost always, at least in my circles. And I wonder, well, what about the food recognition? What about every time we eat a tomato or a potato or a cacao or a pumpkin, do we not recognize where those foods comes from? There's also a choice not to look at the fact that so much of the way that we live and eat depends on indigenous foods. What would happen if we would build a garden that's a pre-colonization garden? What would that look like? What would be in that garden? Do you know the names of the plants that are autochthonous to your lands? What's reestablishing that relationship is really powerful. And I think for sake of time, I'm going to pass it over to you, Loa.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Jessica. That you're not able to explain more. We'd love to hear your story. Jessica, you have a story you just want to do? You want to share?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I will in the next one.
Okay, just because, you know, I did take some time to introduce myself. Well, yeah, you know, well, as I was saying about our migration to the United States as Pasifika people, it's an act of violence, of this forced dislocation. And so coming to the United States, and I hope people can hear me. Really, you know, my prayer that folks can hear what I'm saying. So when we came to the United States, we lost a lot of our we lost our grounding on the land, and they're separated, like so many indigenous communities are, including the indigenous communities here on Ohlone Territory. The Ohlone themselves have been here. And so I feel that my ancestors have continued on my journey to be able to work with young people in the high schools and to work with my own community in creating gardens, you know, because we are a community that does not have a lot of resources. We don't have money to buy land. Just like the Native people too, who live on this land, who are indigenous to this land we live on. And so, so I have seen just the miracle of young people, of older Pasifika people, of elders, including myself and my own family, coming to a reclaiming of who we are, coming to a belonging under the leadership of the Lisjan of this land through growing our fruits. We're able in Failoli to grow. Failoli is like an 800-acre estate. And they have given us 2 rows in their vegetable garden to grow in. But Failoli is in Woodside, which is a neighborhood of great wealth. You know, that the houses there are all safe. And why have said yes to growing in Failoli is because it's also our neighborhoods where a lot of Pasifika people live, like in East Palo Alto, one of the poorest places here in California, that they live next door to Failoli. And they have the access to come there to plant. And to have our people come to plant, lots of young people who have never seen a taro plant before in their lives, who have never seen like a kumala plant, the sweet potato, how the sweet potato grows, has been life-changing, has given them a grounding, has helped these young people and even older and elders to remember this from our homelands, to have given them a new reason to live, a new way to live a life in this place, in this new home that we live in, with the under the stewardship of the indigenous people of the Ramaytush in Failoli, in the land that Failoli is on. So that's just something I like to share.
Thanks, Ola. So our last question here is, what are the challenges that we are facing in working with food trying to work towards this healing? Can I have those slides up? So I wanted to show this slide. This is the slide of wild rice. This is wild rice in its natural state on the lakes and rivers of Minnesota. it's a wild plant. It's a distinction that's really complicated, because this is the wild plant, and then it was domesticated, and it's still called wild rice even when it's domesticated. Okay, so the wild plant in traditional culture sense, a long time ago, way before the Anishinaabe people who are there now were eating this. This has been eaten for 10,000 years. So it's harvested with a canoe. 2 people in a canoe, 1 person pushes the canoe, the other person brings the sticks over the canoe and knocks the grains into the canoe. So it's very labor intensive. Once you get the grain in your hands, then it's a hugely labor intensive process also of preparing the grain for eating. It stores really well. It can store for years underground or even in your kitchen. It never gets eaten by bugs. It's an amazing food. It's very highly nutritious. So this is little by little in the 50s and 60s, people started to say, hey, this is a really interesting food. And then it was slowly domesticated in the 60s. Can we pass it to the other slide, please? So this is what most production of wild rice looks like today. It's produced in fields with tractors. The people who benefit from this food are no longer the native people. The majority of the economy of wild rice goes to white farmers. So in looking at really trying to understand what are the challenges to the reparations in this case, part of the unlearning of the personal practice is also, what are we buying? What's our food? What being interested in the differences between these kinds of foods. So one thing in my research that I'm finding very regularly is what I'm calling purposeful ignorance. The choice not to know. There are many, many, many people in Minnesota who don't know the difference between one wild rice and the other, besides the price. So hand-harvested wild rice right now can go for about $20 a pound, and cultivated rice goes for 2 or 3. That's a huge difference. But people don't know why and where that difference comes from. This is clearly a colonial structure that's really difficult to get around, because you could say, well, what would happen if we would actually, recognize the primacy of the native people in the fact that we can eat this food today, and we would put, a percentage of money from each pound harvested in this way towards native tribes. But we're still stuck, as we were speaking about in the last session, in the colonial capitalist structures and ways of thinking and relating. And it no longer is about, reestablishing relationship with that food. The economic contribution is insufficient. So how do we get outside of these structures? And the fact that this appropriation is not, in this case, you can put Loa back on, actually, thanks. In this case, I'm talking about wild rice, but this is something that's going on, in so many different foods across the world. Quinoa, acai, the native people, indigenous people responsible for these foods and who have been stewarding these foods since they were wild plants are not benefiting from these foods. And so what can we do in that sense to really create these kinds of reparations besides reestablishing connection ourselves with the foods that we eat? The other thing that I don't have the answer, I think it's very complicated. The other thing that I see besides purposeful ignorance is socially accepted racism and sexism. Socially accepted racism is when I ask people, for example, about why there are so few native-owned processing plants for the wild rice. They say, yeah, native people, they're lazy. They can't hold the business together. And this is something that's said very outright to me without any sense of, maybe I shouldn't be saying this on tape. And I think that this is an extreme example of something that's also very pervasive in society, all around us, within us. I speak for myself without knowing it. So I think that on one hand, it's tackling really straight on the purposeful ignorance and the socially accepted racism is what would be my suggestions for today. Loa?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, we are running out of time. Again, I pray my ancestors that people can hear me as I'm speaking. I'm so sorry that I didn't have my headphones ready. Okay. Yeah, just speaking, I'm just going to speak to that point you just said, Jessica. You know, the settler colonial ways of looking at a piece of land and only seeing profit in it is the complete opposite of how Indigenous people look at land. So that's not, so of course we're accused of being lazy and we're not able to market and work hard, that we're not hard workers. And we don't want progress in our lives. You know, we don't want anything good in our lives. And that's, yeah, and that's, in Indigenous ways, we really honor the land. And we always we look at the land and we care about the land and think, what will happen to the land in the next 7 generations? So in what ways can we, as stewards of the land today, in the face of great settler colonialism, in the face of neoliberalism and continued colonization, in the face of our own genocide, how is it that we care, we fight genocide? How is it that we fight capitalism and still be here as stewards of the land for the next 7 generations to come? So that's just something that I want to leave with all of you. And that's something that happens with the Anishinaabe there in Minnesota. And then I see that here with the Lisjan Ohlone under the leadership of Queen Agul, their tribal chair, and trying to save the sacred sites. The sacred site is the land. The land is a sacred site. And the land for Indigenous people is an extension of our own bodies. And I just want to say to our audience there, you know, and that we are all from Indigenous people, everybody. I'm just honored and grateful that I do remember that I'm in a place in my life that I am part of an Indigenous people. But you know, just like the land acknowledgement, where there's a confusion, there's not of who the Indigenous people are of Oxford, England, where I read on Wikipedia, the Britain Celts. You know, we are all from Indigenous people. We are all from a people. We all have great, great, great grandparents who cared and loved and stewarded and preserved the lands that we're on, or the lands that the family comes from. So you could have, so you could survive and you could live, so you could come to this conference and reclaim that knowledge, that you join other conferences and that you go on this path and this journey to learn that and to learn how we can honor and respect the land instead of looking at land as only profit and only destruction and war, which is very prevalent today as I speak, as you all know. Thank you.
Well, I hope that something came across between our 2 experiences and this difficult sound situation. I don't know if there's any comments or questions there in the audience. Mm-hmm.
You say, you know, wouldn't it be great if people ate like ingredients that actually are grown or that come from the sea, these things that come from the British Isles? And people always say things like, oh, you'll be eating cabbages for half the year. I kind of want to open up that question and see what people think in the room about that.
They come true.
But why do people believe it?
Go at it. Go at it.
Me?
Well, anyone.
People believe lots of things about food that aren't true.
Hi. Oh gosh. So I lived at Tinkersborough Eco Community, where we produced maybe 50 to 80% of our own food. And what I would say about that is that we're used to getting tomatoes in winter. And a lot of my work centres on how to preserve without sugar, right? Like a lot of these skills, as has kind of been mentioned today, are forgotten skills in this country. And it's going to take, sadly, because it's kind of cut off over generations, it takes a long time to get that knowledge back. But even as close as Italy, for example, you've got grandmothers with those skills still. And essentially, it's actually related to food culture. Because if we think that we need to eat the same thing all year round, we're just wrong. But that's the industrial food model, is to just fly things in from overseas and benefit from cheap labour. But you can, you can store potatoes, you can store squash.
And actually to eat the same things all year round.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More. Store tomatoes every day.
Down here.
I think we can speak without the mic.
But it's for the recording.
Yeah, well, thank you, Loa, thank you, Jessica, thank you, everyone. I think something that I would like to add to the debate that you're proposing and what we've been building on is that I think that one of the main challenges that we face, maybe at a more subtle or less material lens around capitalism, is that it's very easy for us to sometimes separate the world of ideas and what is a critique to a capitalist system, and then how does that translate materially in the realities that we engage and how we are part of. And I think maybe that addresses a little bit the issue on like all of these myths around food is because we are starting this conversation from an understanding that food is a commodity, that food is something unnatural to us, or unnatural, separated, with a lot of like pit stops along the way, and the truth, or what has been the challenge in the conversation, or how this conversation has been changed, is what it was mentioned earlier today in the plenary by the Woods. It's a reclamation of realities that existed, and it's actually a very short-term amnesia of how we relate amongst ourselves and with the land. So it's kind of like, in all of these collective conversations, there's an inevitable ask to look within, and how food can be a very powerful vector to materialize new ways of existing and relating. And it starts maybe with a simple intention. So, yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. And I think we have to stop there. Thanks so much for that question and all of those answers. Loa, would you like to close with your poem? Oh, can't hear you.
Yeah, I'd like to close. Thank you, Jessica. So again, I ask the ancestors to please help me that you all can hear this poem I'm going to read. I also want to ask the audience that when you attend an event with Indigenous people who are speaking, or that you do search out workshops and conferences where Indigenous people are sharing things, that you also attend and open your hearts and your minds and not only have your own solutions already. Just you go and you take it in and then you go home, and that it continues to, that these ideas grow in you and in your heart and in your mind. And that you could also connect to the Indigenous parts of yourselves. So that's just a challenge that I extend to all of you here in this room. This poem, I actually don't know what the title is, but it's a poem that I wrote when I worked at Segorite as a land steward there. So I'm going to read it, and it is a poem of working on land here in Oakland, California. which is also called Lisjan Ohlone Territory. And here it goes. Something that is become clear to me is that I love you. Land rich with worms and pieces of plastic. We dig and dig and think of our lives. Sometimes we forget about our home and build. Under a sky of hawks and crows is a new world to us. Water tanks, soap root, the Ohlone say mugwort. Yerba buena fills the air, covers my feet. The peach and almond blossoms gently grow out of my ears. Arugula blossoms and giant calories. Hummingbird becomes my cheeks. My belief in the world is I'm becoming the moon, full and unashamed, surrounded by art. We work in one breath. Rake, shovel, nail. Drill pieces so different together in our long, short life.
Thank you very much.